Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with BASEDPolitics, and if you're looking for my regular programming this week, you're not going to find it because I am on the road in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, and it is just quite simply too hard to keep my regular production schedule while traveling. That being said, I do have a very special surprise appearance I will be making that you will get to see in the coming weeks, so stay tuned for that. And while I'm out this week, in place of Histrionics and the BASEDPolitics podcast, I thought I would bring you a video I've been holding in my back pocket for a little bit now. As many of you probably know if you followed my content, I am very pro-immigration. During the original series of Based, I did an entire deep dive into the history of immigration and laid out the case for why I believe that it is a capitalist issue and why I believe it is always a net positive for society. You can watch that old video here. I'm not going to reiterate my case today, but just to be clear, I think that it is perfectly fine for a country to have borders. What I would mostly like to see would be a return to Ellis Island style immigration. Basically, a policy of we let most people in as long as they have no criminal history. If you want to come here and work, awesome. That's good for us. I think immigration should be easy, breezy, and fast. And I think that if we had that kind of system again, we could then focus our resources on actually stopping the bad people who are trying to come here. It's just common sense. Citizenship, in my opinion, is a secondary issue. I don't really care as much about that. I'm fine with making that a higher burden. But I believe that free movement is not only a human right, I also think it is essential for free market capitalism to work. Currently, we have nothing of the sort. I am always baffled by the number of people who will claim that we have all of these open border supporters in our government. Joe Biden is just as anti-immigrant as Trump. I don't know what you guys are smoking or where you're getting your news. But a few months ago, I was invited to go to the border with a foundation that I often work with, Americans for Prosperity's Foundation. They were doing a group trip to McAllen, Texas, which has been one of the main border checkpoints for people who are trying to come here. And I agreed to go, and I wanted to go with the mindset of being open to being wrong. There are many people who say that we need to let far fewer people in, that what is happening around the border right now is absolutely necessary, that we should be putting people in camps. So I went down to see, was I wrong? Are people right about what's happening at the border? I try my best to always be intellectually open-minded, and that's the posture I went down with. My brother Josiah actually came down with me to film, so huge shout out to him. I'm going to be showing you some of the photography from my trip, but also once I got down there, I was able to meet with several experts, and my initial plan was just to summarize those conversations in a video, but after some of the people I encountered, I decided that was not good enough. I absolutely had to get these guys in front of you. One of them is a former ICE chief, and one of them is one of the largest peach farmers in the country. I was able to talk with them and learn so much, both from a policy standpoint and then also from a practical standpoint of what these policies look like on the ground. I will say that I came away from this trip and these conversations still being very much pro-immigration, but I will also say that that stance is now much more informed, much more grounded in the realities of what we are currently dealing with as a country, and hopefully much more insightful for all of you who are not able to actually go down to the border yourselves. So without further ado, I'm going to bring you two conversations that I filmed post-border trip with these experts, and I'm going to let you hear from them yourselves. First, I'm going to roll my conversation with Chris Klim, who is, as I said, a former ICE chief. Welcome to the show. I'm thrilled to have you. Can you talk to us about how you first got involved with this work?
Yeah, well, first of all, Hannah, great to be on your show, and what a wonderful introduction. Yeah, let's just take it back. I joined the U.S. Border Patrol in 1995, right out of college. Literally just was, looking for, some kind of law enforcement career. I was a criminal justice major out of Sam Houston State University, and back then it was a fax that was sent to our advisor's office, and the grad assistant said, "Hey, you guys should look at this." And my roommate and I, we followed the instructions, called the number, and when we fast forward, we within a few months, we were offered tentative job offers, went through background checks, and I got on an airplane out of Houston, Texas, and flew to El Paso on July 9th when I started my federal career, July 9th, 1995. And I had spent most of my career along the southwest border. I had, as an agent, as a senior agent, I was able to be a firearms instructor, a canine handler, an intelligence officer, and moved up into supervisory roles and management roles, started commanding my own stations. I actually commanded 4 stations in 3 states. And that, kind of put me on the map as far as how I could really step up in that leadership role in executive positions. And so I was asked to come up to Washington, D.C. That was an experience, going from, a ground agent, really an operator, leading the men and women through challenging times, to going up into the political beltway. You grow in dog years in Washington, D.C. I mean, it was 2.5 years on the calendar, but wow, it was different. That was 2012 I got there in November of 2012, and I was there till March of 2015. So there was a lot of things happening policy-wise under the Obama-Biden administration, impacting the border. I got out when I could, and I was the deputy chief in New Orleans, Louisiana, of all places. And that's actually my hometown where I was born, lived there for a few years. So that was nice to kind of have a homecoming of sorts. That was a different perspective because it was a coastal sector, but it wasn't like we were having landings. It wasn't people going across the Gulf of Mexico. It was really, over the interstate trafficking and smuggling coming from South Texas, working its way up into, northern Louisiana, the I-20, I-30, I-40 corridor in Tennessee. We did operations up there. But I was homesick. My family had stayed back in Arizona, so I got back to Arizona there for less than 6 months when I got promoted into the senior executive services. And by the time that all came around, I ended up in El Paso less than 1 year after, or right about 1 year after I got home. My wife just knew it. She's like, I know you're going to get this job. That's just, you've only been home for a year. And went to El Paso as the deputy chief. So I was the number 2 for the El Paso sector from April of 18 to December of 20. And that was, El Paso was ground zero. A lot of stuff happening there. Acting chief for a while there, acting chief in Marfa. So I spent a lot of time in the West Texas, New Mexico region. Finally got the nod and promoted to Yuma to be the chief patrol agent of Yuma in December 2020 when I showed up for work there. And I was there as the chief for just over 2 years when I retired after 27 and a half years as a Border Patrol agent. And so that's really that's the career path, right? There's the 27 and a half years of movement in multiple states, almost a dozen moves with and without family. But there's so much to the story about the men and women and what the mission has become, what it has been, what it should be. And obviously we talked a lot about that in McAllen. So I want to take a breath and let you ask the questions, but hopefully I kind of captured a little bit of everything. But it was an experience, and I want your audience to know that was 5 presidential administrations that I worked under. And I will tell you this and make it very clear that every administration, the first 4 anyway, had leaned very heavily and forward on border security, throwing in some immigration things along the way. But it really, this administration has, pretty much put a hold on everything that we were doing from the security standpoint. And again, another foot stomp is that there is a difference, and you and I talked about it, between border security and immigration. They are cousins, they're closely related, but all too often, mainstream media, politicians, they conflate them and provide us false choices. You can't be pro-security, that means you're anti-immigrant, or if you're pro-immigrant, that means you're open border, and that couldn't be further from the truth. It's about securing our country and creating the lawful pathways. So,
Yeah, I honestly, your framing was revolutionary even for me, because I think I've fallen into that camp where I'm like, I'm pro-immigrant. And so I, have often recoiled at a lot of the rhetoric that occurs around these subjects. And it's so nice to break those things apart. It's totally common sense to approach it that way, but you are totally correct that the media doesn't approach it in that capacity. Most politicians are not coming at it from that angle. And I think as a citizen, it can often be hard for somebody who doesn't trust media at all, right? And who doesn't really trust politicians, because I know there's always an agenda, to understand how bad is it really at the border. And I think what's great about you is you've seen such a wide span of time. You've seen the difference under very different administrations. Can you talk to us about what that reality is? Is the crime, is the threat as bad as many would say? Has it gotten worse over time? And what are the choices they're making right now? How is that making us more vulnerable?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and you bring up such valiant points, right? Because this is where we need to be. This is border security shouldn't be a political issue. It's an American issue. It's about keeping things safe, and we'll talk about the tall fences, wide gate concepts. But yeah, evolution over time, it was really a Mexican national, single adult male Mexican national border issue. And that was because we had seasonal workers and we were still doing things from really a farm and labor perspective. And this is going back, decades, well before my time. But when I got in the 90s, it was still a lot of that. Most of the people we were apprehending were single adult Mexican national males. And many of them were laborers, and they were coming in. I've spent most of my early career in New Mexico. It was all farming. And these people were, trying to go do agricultural work and work in the fields. And it was seasonal. And, but it was still against the law. So we would arrest them and we would process them. We would just send them right back to Mexico under a voluntary return. The only other dynamic that was happening there is you did have some mom and pop type smuggling organizations that were, loading people in cars and taking them to other parts of the country, really to look for work. Mixed in there was a lot of the drug smuggling, the drug mules back when marijuana was the big cash crop. That was the thing to do. That was the fun part, was tracking people that were backpacking 1,000 pounds of marijuana in the mountains. And it was a lot more kind of exciting for us as agents because you didn't know what you were going to go up against. But that was kind of most of it in the 90s. And then obviously we had the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and that kind of changed the focus, rightfully so, on national security and border security. They are one and the same. But the dynamic of who was impacting the border at that time wasn't still mainly Mexican nationals, sprinkling some Central Americans. But that really started changing, I would say, in the late 2000s, early 2000 teens. We started seeing across the board Central Americans, Northern Triangle countries, and Mexican nationals. But we started seeing an increase of family units. That was a big thing because most of it was single adults, mainly males. Easy for Border Patrol to process, hold in our facilities. But when you started having family units come in, mom and dads with kids, small children, that started kind of changing up the whole, how do we hold them? How do we care for them? And then it was probably 2014 when we had the big unaccompanied child surge. That was happening in South Texas, mainly in the Rio Grande Valley where we were, literally hundreds of kids at a time. Mainly, we single adult as anybody under 17 and younger without any parent or legal guardian. But some of these were tender age, 8, 9, even younger. That became a big mess for the administration, especially the Obama administration. And again, I think too, just for, kind of going back in history, President Obama entering his second term wanted comprehensive immigration reform. Mm-hmm. The Democrats and his administration were all for it. The Republicans said, okay, but we want border security. So there was this big debate, and there was a lot of things done for border security under President Obama. He built a lot of wall. He removed a lot of people because he was going to get that border security piece under control so he could get his immigration reform. Well, then the Republicans at the time, led by Senator McCain, really kind of started arguing the definition of control. Well, what is control? And it just kind of imploded. Now, the agents were the benefactors of a lot of things. We started receiving more agents under then President Bush and then into Obama. Then we started building more infrastructure on the border, really brought our national strategy together. And then it all just kind of came to a screeching halt because of politics. And that was one of the many cell phone and a pen executive actions that the president took. And that really kind of changed the dynamics on the border because it gave the smugglers kind of an insight that, hey, if we get you in at this point, you may be allowed to stay because the dynamics had changed. Fast forward now. So you have, and I think this is really important where we're kind of getting close to today's time. You had candidate Trump talk about building the wall. That was a campaign slogan, build the wall. It was easy to remember. It was red meat. It was like, we're going to do this, right? It was good. It was good. And for us, we needed it. We knew. But we're career employees. We don't get into the politics. But it was so much more than a wall for us. It was the wall where it made sense. It was the technology. It was the access roads. It was the sensors. It was the cameras. It was the lights that we needed along the border. And so when it became President Trump, after a few hard months of negotiations and kind of explaining the dynamics, all our requirements were put forth by the agents. Everything we needed on the border was a package from the ground up. Through chiefs like me, signed up into Washington. We started doing all that. And we started seeing one of the most secure, successful borders that we had seen. And I tell you the numbers offhand, as things started rolling out, building wall, adding technology, adding the roads. We started backing up with some strong policies, even controversial ones that were, clunky but effective, like the Remain in Mexico. It's the Mexican Migrant Protection Protocol, but known as Remain in Mexico. It started cutting out these asylum loopholes because people were getting a foot on the ground and saying, oh, asylum, or I have fear of return. And it was jamming up the system. When you backed infrastructure with strong policies, those numbers went from, in 2019, Hannah, we had just over 900,000 arrests in the Border Patrol, and then dropped to 400,000, just over 400,000 in 2020. That was great for us. I mean, that was like, there was still stuff going on, but wow, the requirements for our agents were being met. The policy that we needed to reinforce that with consequences were being met. Now, this is the big thing. When President Biden took office, and we all know the number was like 94 executive actions in the first hours, days, and months into his presidency, it stopped the wall. It was, I think, one of the names of the executive actions was like halt the wall or stop the wall.
Yeah.
Well, remember, it wasn't just the wall. It was the wall system. So I was the chief in Yuma when that happened. We had stacks and stacks of steel right next to these, 200, 300, 400-yard gaps along the wall that we couldn't do anything with. We had over 1,000 camera poles that we couldn't turn on the cameras. We had light plants or light towers. We couldn't plug in to energize the lights. All of that, the fiber optic cable systems that we wanted for sensors. The trenching was done, spools and spools of fiber optic just sitting there, and the numbers, year one, 2021 under the administration, went up to 1.66 million. And then the next year it was 2.2 million. And the year after that it was like 2. Yeah. And nothing changed for us. I still had the 950 Border Patrol agents, but we were catching over 1,000 people a day at one point. That is what is impacted. So getting to that one final part of that question, like, this is what's really happening at the border. They're averaging about 6,000 arrests a day right now, which is amazing because under President Obama, Jay Johnson even said 1,000 is overwhelming the system. I can only 3,000 would be a crisis. Well, we're double that. Now, we were at 12,000 a day in December, so it's dropped to 50%, but it's 6,000 a day. We don't have any room. Many of the executive actions cut the detention space, so we can't hold anybody. And that's why you're seeing these mass releases of people into the communities, and then they're going throughout the country. Now, the crime piece to your question. So when people get apprehended by Border Patrol, whether we've chased them or they've turned themselves in, we take their biometric data, okay? But it is only as good as the system. If we're banking or vetting that against an empty hard drive, there's nothing in the system. So if you are a serial killer, I'm just using this as hypothetical. If you're a serial killer in Venezuela, but you've never been arrested and never been in the database, we would never know that. We would just take your information, the criminal history, the immigration, the wants and warrants would come back negative. And if there's no place to hold you, we have to release you. Now, again, that's an extreme example, but it's a real example, because if the information is not in the systems that we run them against, they're not wanted by Interpol or some international FBI system, we're not going to know who they are. And if we don't have the ability to detain them until we can determine who they are beyond their initial information, where they're going, what's their intent, who are their sponsors, they have family members here, all the stuff, we don't get that luxury, and we end up having to let them go. And then you have, and again, I've never broad brushed an entire demographic, and I wouldn't do that today. But you do have those examples that have happened with Lake and Riley and others. These are people that were caught and released that ended up committing crimes further in the country. And, that's the sad reality, is this is probably gets worse before it gets better, because we have to let these people go because of the policies. And that's the hard part. That's what really is difficult for the agents, because they know, like, that situation that happened last week in El Paso, where again, a good chunk of the people that we encounter have those tendencies, and our agents see that, and we're like, we can't keep them. We have to let them go. And that's a frustrating part for a lot of it. I know I talked along, and that's me. I start getting excited about it, but I want to answer more questions, obviously, and I want to get into the tall fences, wide gates, because I could talk about problems all day long. We got to start talking about solutions, because problems sell in the media, but people don't want to talk about solutions.
Mm-hmm. And this is, I think, where you definitely impressed me the most. I was very candid with you. We were grabbing a drink at the bar down in McAllen, and I said, full disclosure, I am pretty much an open borders type libertarian. I think free movement is a fundamental right. I think you have a right to flee from hunger, flee from war, to find work for your family. And to me, that's always been kind of a separate question than like formal immigration, whether or not you become a citizen or not. I don't care, but the ability to move and work and protect yourself is fundamental, in my opinion. And secondarily, one of my core principles when I'm looking at public policy is that I don't think bans work. They don't work on drugs. They don't work on guns. They don't work on labor. So when we have a really tight immigration system that makes it really hard to come here legally, then obviously you're going to have a black market. And I think that's clearly what we're seeing at the border. And that's only compounded because of things like the war on drugs and the ability to traffic guns and all of those things you guys have had to deal with. Your response to that, I thought, was so illuminating. And you have this concept that I think you came up with of tall fences, wide gates. Can you talk to us about that and how this is really the way to kind of satisfy everybody on both sides, people who want a secure border, who are really concerned with crime, and then also people who are really concerned with fundamental civil liberties and capitalism and the ability to get labor when you need it? I think you've got the answers.
Well, I appreciate that. So if you go back to 2008 Republican primary, late Senator Fred Thompson from Tennessee was asked about border security. It was being brought up again, going back 16 years ago. And he mentioned something, and I'm kind of paraphrasing. He said we should be of tall fences and wide gates. And I was a station commander at the time, and I was listening to that, and I was like, wow, you know what? He just, a picture tells 1,000 words, right? So I see tall fences, wide gates, and it resonated with me. So I have just kind of adopted that over the last 16 years, and it was in the back of my brain forever, and or in that 16-year time frame. But the last few years, as we were battling this, even when I was chief and deputy chief, and now since I've retired from Border Patrol, I've kind of expanded on that and really kind of delved into it and used that as the base to the solution. And, again, very quickly, the tall fences represent the border security system, that is so necessary for any country and for any part of our world. The wide gates represent the lawful and legal pathways. And so I'll dissect that a little bit more, and I usually start by saying there's a lot of people, that live in, gated communities we have locks on our front doors. We have locks on our bedroom doors. And if you have a bathroom in your bedroom, you got a lock on that. But as soon as we talk about a tall fence or a lock on our country's front door, it becomes, divisive and emotional. And again, the conflation of immigration and border security, and that's why I was like, wait a second, you have to secure the border. You have to, fundamentally protect the country and the border communities, because without that, every town becomes a border town. Every state becomes a border state because of the bad actors, because of the people that are criminals, rapists, terrorists, drug runners, gang members, all these people that are going to do harm, right? And then that also, again, compounds the lawful process, because even the 8-9 million people that have come in the last few years that are getting hearings, that are out for almost 7 or 8 years now, they're logging up the system and jamming up the system for those that have been doing things the right way. So you have to secure that to protect the country. Now you go with wide gates, and that to me is not only the ports of entry where people are supposed to enter and out, come in and out of the country legally. By making it a gate, you can open it as wide as you need to based on the circumstances, or you can close it or make it as narrow depending on the circumstances. Like if we have an issue right now, probably need to narrow that gate. But you know what? When things are up and running, we can widen that gate. But what does that gate mean? So first of all, the very tenet of our country is being a beacon of hope when it comes down to immigration. All right. I mean, obviously we're a country of laws, and and as a law enforcement agent, career agent, I support the rule of law, but I also support that we have an opportunity to give others around the world. And number one, if we can find ways to attract and attain the best and brightest to come through here, it should not take years or a lifetime to get a visa to come over here. We should be able to streamline that process. At the same time, if we have people that are truly being persecuted for reasons that, are, from origin to gender to political groups, whatever that is, if they're truly being persecuted, then that's where the asylum and the opportunities to seek refuge should come. And we should be able to have that system in place to be much smoother, to provide them that relief and get them that hearing, to get them that status. And the system is so overwhelmed that we can't even do some of the basic fundamentals of that in a reasonable amount of time. And then also, when you have created all this chaos in between the ports, it makes the commerce and the basic principles of a strong economy of this country, they're the backlogs at the ports. You have trucking industry and bringing food and supplies and everything else backlog for miles. It takes hours to come to the United States if that's what their job is, to move trade and travel. And that's another issue that's all jammed up because we won't start with the basic principles of securing the border and smoothing out those wide gates to let people come in. Now, I want to also make it very clear, too, is not everybody deserves a bite at this apple, because there are people that are taking advantage of the system, that know that, hey, they live in a rough neighborhood in Guatemala, doesn't mean they get to jump in the front of the line and take advantage and exploit people. So if they are doing that, then we absolutely need to have a consequence for them breaking the law or abusing the system, because every time you have somebody that abuses a system, unfortunately, those that are waiting in line, that are doing things the right way, they get pushed further back. And that, to me, is where we're at right now. And that, again, becomes a concern because now they're floating around amnesty. And that in itself can be a good thing. But what that does in today's world, it's a pull factor. It is going to encourage more people to decide to get involved in a journey which is going to put them in the hands of smugglers and traffickers. And most of the migrants that get trafficked don't realize it until it's too late, because the horrors that you can only imagine that maybe you've seen in a movie happen every day to migrants on the journey through here. And that's why, again, being clear is kind. Clear being there, we are securing this border and we are going to clean up these lawful pathways so we can manage expectations and people understand the right way to come here, because just having them come in here and then you roam in the country for 4 or 5 years before they get a hearing is not very kind, because it is not managing the expectations, and they've been put in the hands of traffickers and smugglers along the way. So that's why I firmly believe is you be very smart with common sense. We don't need a wall from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. Okay, we don't. We need it in very specific strategic locations to prevent people from coming in and getting away. But we also need technology and all the other things that come with it. But we have to start with the basic foundation of securing it, and then work with that wide gate and those various lawful pathways for small business owners, for academia. Look, if we can't find the workforce here in the United States for a small business or big business, then where are we going to get that? We have to get it from foreign workers. Why will it take 2 years and thousands of dollars in dealing with multiple federal agencies when there should be a better way? And the last thing I'll say again, and I'm sure your audience, this guy doesn't shut up, is some of our work visa and visa permits, or quotas, if you will, were established in the late 1960s. Like, that to me in 2024 is preposterous. Like, how can we be archaic in our system and antiquated in how we do this? But I will say this. Last thing I'll say is I'm a border security expert. That's what I did. I'm not the immigration expert. They're closely related. I have a lot of knowledge on that. But as far as getting to which visas is, there's other people for that. But I will say this. The decision has to be made by we the people, and those that are working and business owners, community leaders, the ranchers, the farm and labor people, not bureaucrats up in Washington, D.C., because they're going to get hijacked by certain lobby groups and things like that. Congress has got to act on this at some point. They need to go out to their representative body. They need to talk to their people and say, what is it that American workforce can't provide that we need to provide when it comes down to labor? And then come up with that solution. Expand a certain visa process. We can use technology. I think the CBP One app that is being used is being hijacked and misused. But I don't doubt that we can't use technology to streamline some of these applications, get them vetted, and get them in here. Again, those that we need, those that we can't find here, and then again, also not excluding those that are being persecuted and need sanctuary if they can't find it, someplace else. We need to be able to continue to be that beacon of hope for around the world, but we still have to start with the rule of law and secure the border too. So hopefully that kind of gave you some of the answers you're looking for.
Absolutely. It's very informative. I remember you and I actually stood at a portion of the Rio Grande, and we were looking at some of the wall that's been built, some of the barbed wire that's been put up. And we were right next to a water facility, and there was a large concrete boat ramp that came up from the water. And you had this wall and the barbed wire, and you had this boat ramp. And I'm like, why would they not just walk up the boat ramp? And you pointed out that this is why, you cannot just simply build a wall. There are places that make sense to build a wall, but our border is so vast. You have eminent domain issues, you have natural wildlife protection issues, and you have just simple geographical obstacles for how the land juts in and out, water obstacles, etc. And so you touched on how we need a really comprehensive approach that involves a lot more technology, better communication, clear policies, and it's very obvious in looking back over the patterns when those things have been better secured versus now, how that's differentiated things. And I think for me, one of the most compelling things is recognizing how much this current system is putting people who are trying to do things the right way in danger. We went into one of the Catholic services that was housing people and helping them find their sponsors for release. And through a translator, I spoke to one guy who was trying to come here for a legal court date that he'd been given. And he and his son were kidnapped by a cartel, sold to another cartel, held for 10 or 11 days in total squalor. Their wife had to come up with thousands of more dollars to pay for their release. They were threatening to cut their fingers off. It was horrifying. And so I really do think people, even in my camp, need to recognize there is nothing civil or compassionate about what's currently happening. It's getting people killed. It's getting people harmed. And I think you even told me a significant number of people who do cross over give up immediately, right? They turn themselves in. They want to encounter legal processes.
Yeah, so I would go as high as saying about 90% of the apprehensions that we're currently receiving, so well over a million plus every year the last few years, are just turning themselves in, because that is the look. A couple things I want to hit on real quick. We'll finish this thought here. Is cartels have realized that smuggling people and trafficking people is much more profitable for them, because they're paying in advance most of the time, or they're making arrangements in advance. The people are getting to the smugglers, and they only have to get them to the border. The idea of delivering them to a destination city in the United States is limited to very small groups now. So they can pay the money, and again, they pay anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 to get across, and not everybody has that money in advance. So you end up getting making arrangements which aren't always good. So they just have to get them to the border, and then the border patrol and is basically, and the government is completing that smuggling cycle, because we're going to process them. We're going to get them to a non-government organization. Non-government organization is going to help them go to their destination as part of the process that of releasing. And of course, the non-government organization is going to get reimbursed by FEMA. So there's a big money cycle there. Narcotics, they have to get the drugs in, the precursors, let's see, like fentanyl and other things, has to come in. They have to make it. They have to have a buyer. They have to smuggle it across. They have to get it to the buyer, and then they have to get the money back. So it becomes a little more risky. So they've realized they can make billions of dollars smuggling people. And in between there is where you're going to have the further exploitation and extortion of people, like the example you just described. And here's the thing: the mother or the woman involved in this scenario, they know where she's at, because she's going to send money. So now she's got her life, and don't think one moment that she's not being threatened physically or mentally. Plus, if it truly is her husband and child, she's worried sick. So the cartel has now trafficked that group. It is because as soon as you have lost control and they've got you mentally controlled, and you're not free to go, you're trafficked. That's indentured servitude, and no telling what kind of extortions, things that could have happened. So, and that goes on, and we could go on for days, because there's still organ harvesting that goes on in these stash houses and places like that, and people getting discarded. And so when you hear stories over the last several decades of mass graves being found, These are the things that are happening, right? And that's why it is so frustrating for us from a morale perspective and everything else when you say, oh, well, this is a humanitarian crisis. You bet you know what it's a humanitarian crisis, because these policies and the lack of will by Washington to really stand firm and be clear and secure the border and smooth out the pathways is putting people in harm's way. Watching people getting beat up, murdered, or raped in front of you is a mind control. And that's what's happening in these stash houses along the way. Now, that, again, that's just horror, and we're hopefully all grown adults on this the audience that they can use their own imagination. Second point, that area down there in McAllen at the boat launch, there's a couple things I want to talk about. You went to one sector down in Rio Grande. You've been to one sector. That's just it. You've been to one sector. Every sector, and there's 9 on the southwest border, 8 on the northern border, and 3 along the coastal borders, to include Puerto Rico. Everyone has their own set of unique challenges in regards to urban environments, infrastructure as far as highways and railways and bus stations and airports, but also geography. You may have linear border miles of 200 linear miles along the Rio Grande in South Texas, but that may be 500 river miles the way it's snaking. So you can't just build a section of fence. The canopy down there, the vegetation, the trees, you saw that. It's impenetrable. You can't see through it. So a camera system that just sees left and right wouldn't work in Texas like you need something above looking down to try to penetrate the canopy. So you can't broad brush and cookie cut technology in Rio Grande Valley. Now, out in West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, where I was, especially in Yuma, you could set up a camera system and have one every 5-10 kilometers because they can see so well, because it's so flat and open in between mountain ranges. So again, different dynamic. If you've been to one sector, you've been to just one sector. And that's another thing that's difficult for people to understand. The river where we were, there's probably a channel that made it 8 or 9 feet deep in the middle. It was probably 4 feet across. But you go up to areas like El Paso and parts of Big Bend, and it's dry because it's just been rerouted or it's just a trickle. And so that's where different type of infrastructures and strategies come apart or come in play. And lastly, in that area like where we were, you need people. You need people to be able to respond to that because technology doesn't work as well. And then the other point that you brought out, and I kind of laughed at it, and I laughed because it becomes such a divisive and vitriolic and rhetorical or rhetoric-based conversation with the mainstream media and certain political groups about like the barbed wire. Yeah, that barbed wire did nothing, okay? But I can imagine, and this is not to take a swipe because I do support Texas and what they're trying to fill the gap where the federal government won't do it. They probably had a mileage of how many miles did we need, and they got to deploy it, and they just started right here, right? And it was kind of laughable because I would hope that if somebody crossed the river right there, they wouldn't try to crawl through the razor wire when they could just simply walk around it. But I imagine, and I'm just going to be optimistic, that there was some thought process that as you went upriver, that razor wire would deter people from even making the entry. But again, not to just laugh about it, because we also know that there was cameras right there. There was other things that if somebody was making a crossing and they weren't going to go through the wire, they would walk around, the camera would pick them up. So it is a combination, it is a system of systems, but it does become comical when you come down there and you look at it and you're like, well, there's nothing that stops them coming right here. Now, also for your audience, another quarter mile behind us was a wall. So they could, we have to concede with the river boundary. So if somebody did make it in, they would still be, deterred by not going through the razor wire. They would have about a quarter mile to get to the wall. The cameras were there. I would just assume, being optimistic.
And then an officer would respond.
They would respond to that. Yeah.
So I think it's a good visual though, because I think it does encompass why you need multiple kinds of approaches and one thing's not enough. And obviously when you have like the cartel, they're looking for these areas where it's easier to get across, where it is more simple.
I wouldn't be surprised if they don't have disinformation campaigns. They clearly have disinformation campaigns in areas where they don't want. Yeah, we want to protect the wildlife preserve there and things like that. But I can't imagine why the cartel wouldn't be investing in some of that campaign, right? Like, don't build wall here, right? Because, donating money. I mean, I just that's just how the the black market and the bad guys operate. So it's certainly a factor to consider. I do think that that it is very. I'm glad you noted it. How important the diversity of the environment is out there. And again, one size does not fit all. And I think that's a big misnomer. What I wanted to say on that was that's why when we say it was a Border Patrol requirement, I know that when I ran stations and when I ran sectors, it wasn't me sitting in my deputy chief or my chief office going, we're going to build a wall here. It was out to the field commanders, talk to the agents, bringing a team together and say, okay, what is it that we need here? If we have a wish list, how do we control our 126 miles of border in Yuma? Like, well, chief, we need these cameras. We need this. Okay. So my team would put up a requirements package. And we did that as part of our budget planning every year. But even more so when you had an administration, at least the Trump administration, saying, hey, what is it that you need? And we put those packages forward and those were getting answered. So I want your audience to know, I want everybody to know that the requirements were based on what our agents who are doing the job. I'm in the office 90% of the time as the chief, right? That was, it was a good day to get out and chase people and arrest people. That was a luxury if they let the chief do that. I was probably more of a threat to our agents out there. He hadn't been out in the field in a while. But it was the agents' requirement. It was the people that we have hired who took an oath to protect us, said, we need this. It wasn't bureaucrats and the people up in the Beltway saying, well, we're going to do it this way, we're going to do it that way. No, these were the requirements. And so when you hear about wall and people kind of go, oh, we can't build a wall, it was what our agents said, hey, we need out here. And that's one of the things I always want to fight for them, even since I've retired from the Border Patrol, is to be an advocate for their safety, make their job better. Law enforcement, whether you're a police officer, a county sheriff, a highway patrolman, or a Border Patrol agent, it's not easy. So anything we can do to make their job better and give them a fighting chance to do what they are sworn to do, I want to advocate for that. And that's why that wall system, emphasis on the system, was so very, very important.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for taking time to inform my audience and talk with me again. I think you are just such a great connection point for people who are trying to learn more. Can you let people know where they can find you if they want to follow you or keep up with your work? I know you're still very active on these issues.
Yeah, so at CClem official is on my X handle, formerly known as Twitter. That's that's where I'm probably the most active when it comes down to border security issues. I guess you still call it tweet. I'll tweet out there, or I'll forward things with some comments. My whole kind of direction on this is very, very apolitical, because I spent my whole career as a apolitical career employee, and just informing people with facts and let them make those decisions, but hopefully a little more informed. And I think this is going to, the rhetoric and the media firestorm that'll happen, it'll get worse before it gets better, because we're 7 months away from an election. So I'm glad that you had me on here. I'm grateful that you had me on. It was a pleasure to meet you, and I want to be able to provide information. So look, if something else comes up along the way, you know how to get a hold of me. I'd love to come back on the show and we can talk about current events or whatever the case may be.
Well, I absolutely loved my time getting to know Chief Clem. I thought he was absolutely wonderful. It's always refreshing to meet people in law enforcement when you can tell that they genuinely care about the people that they're dealing with. So often when you encounter people across all law enforcement, they have lost a lot of empathy. They've become very pro-government, and it makes it really hard for me to trust their opinion. I thought Chris Clem was the exact opposite. He's practical, he's not partisan, and he genuinely seems to come at this from a point of view of focusing on the policies that would be best for Americans and best for the people who are trying to become Americans. Next up, I want to introduce you to a man named Chalmers Carr. He is actually my neighbor up in South Carolina. Not like physically my neighbor. I live in Georgia, but you get the point. Fun fact, while Georgia somehow grabbed the name the Peachtree State, we are actually not the top state for the production of peaches. That honor actually goes to South Carolina, and Chalmers Carr is one of the top producers of this fruit, along with many other vegetables and fruits in the country. I absolutely cannot wait for you to hear from him. You're not going to believe what our farmers are dealing with. And he brought up so many angles of the impacts of these policies on our food supply chain to me that I'd never even fully thought through. I thought he was extremely enlightening. So without further ado, I'm just going to roll you my interview with him. Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with Base Politics, and I am thrilled to bring you a special guest today. I had the privilege of meeting Chalmers Carr at the border last month. He is one of the largest peach farmers in the entire United States. He hails from South Carolina, where I've spent a good portion of my life. So he's got a ton of information. I'm really excited for you guys to get to hear firsthand. So, first and foremost, Mr. Carr, can you just tell us how you got into this line of work?
I'll be glad to. And Hannah, first of all, thank you for having me on the show and talking about this very important subject to American agriculture. The border debate has been something that agriculture sometimes has been left out of, and glad to participate. But got into farming after college. Actually worked on my uncle's farm all during my high school and college career. Was fortunate enough to start farming in Florida, bought my first farm there, and then moved to South Carolina in 1995 as a hired farm manager for a gentleman who didn't have any sons and really didn't know what his transition plan was going to be. And I was able to lease his farm in 99 and execute a purchase in 2001. So Titan Farms, the company that my wife and I own, were born in 1999, and we just celebrated 25 years in business.
Congratulations. That's a huge achievement. Now, I live in Georgia. A little known fact, while we are the peach tree state, South Carolina actually produces far more peaches. And you've got more than just that going on, right?
That is correct. We are the second largest grower in the country, second to California. California is the number one peach state. South Carolina is number two.
Okay.
And we kind of joke that Titan Farms, our farm, produces more peaches in the whole state of Georgia, which is an unproven fact, but is by statistics is probably correct.
Yeah, I don't know how Georgia got the peach marketing, but I guess they were just ahead of the game.
I really wish I could have been there for that debate, because I would have pushed them another direction.
Exactly. Now, I've done some work on my shows in the past talking about agriculture issues in general. I think oftentimes farmers are getting kind of a bad rap these days because of some of the decisions of big ag, as we call it, and government getting very intertwined in that business. But you are an independent farmer. I would not count you as part of big ag. You were producing a lot of food. But kind of talk about that. Farmers are up against a lot these days. I know I've spoken with a lot of independent farmers. It really feels like the deck is increasingly getting stacked against you guys.
It definitely is. And I mean, on lots of different fronts. And so it's very hard and what I say in agriculture today, you're either getting bigger or you're getting smaller. There is no room for the middle person. So one is it's not necessarily an easy lifestyle. So, and it's also in rural areas for the most part. So kids nowadays have a lot more options. In fact, my kids' generation, my kids aren't coming back to the farm. So when you think about all the world of opportunities out there for them, but you have to love agriculture. But even if you love it, the stack is stacked against you. I mean, from world trade topics that we have to deal with. And we got to break agriculture down into two segments. You've got the traditional crops, what we call them commodity crops, cotton, corn, soybeans, and all those. And then you have specialty crops. And I am in the specialty crop phase of it. And we're talking about making food, providing food to the rest of the country and outside of our borders as well. But we have to compete on an international level. But sometimes the playing field we're competing on is the rules made here in the U.S. And so when I've got to compete against foreign imports coming from Mexico that are actually labor is 40 to 50% of specialty crops cost, sometimes as high as 80%. And when you've got a labor situation in Mexico where their labor is 15 times less than ours, we can't compete. So you see American companies every day moving production offshore outside of our borders just because of our policy on immigration and policy on labor. So, and those are just some of it. When you look at the new rules on waters of the U.S. and some of the things we're going to be facing out of there, it is a tough deal. And that's why people aren't choosing to do it anymore. My wife and I, we love it. We're completely vested into it. We've been growing our farm, but there are days where you bang your head up against the wall and say, why am I doing this?
Yeah, I bet. Now, I was out in Napa shortly before I met you, and I was learning from some of the farmers there and my driver there even just how hard of a time they have getting labor, that there really is a shortage when it comes to labor, how much Americans simply will not do these jobs. But, you kind of hear in the media, like Americans won't do a lot of jobs anymore. But from what you said, this is not an exaggeration. Americans won't take these jobs, even though from what I understand, they pay pretty darn good.
Well, they do. So we're in the H-2A program. So let's clarify that. But so the H-2A program is a government-run program for seasonal and temporary labor to legally come into the U.S., work, and then go back home. Part of the requirement to participate in is that we have to prove that there are no domestic workers, U.S. workers, wanting to take these jobs. So the first thing we have to do is advertise for these jobs. I've been in this program for 25 years. Started with 175 guest workers in 1999. This year, we'll bring in 860. At this point in the season, we're already 3 months into the season, I've had 3 U.S. workers apply for 800 jobs. 3. So, and that is the norm for the last decade. I mean, really, the biggest influx of workers we had was in the recession or the economic slowdown in 2008, 2009. We got up to about 100 U.S. workers that applied for the job. But here's the other statistic to know: 85% of them quit within the first 2 days. So, I mean, and so we're paying above market wages. South Carolina minimum wage in this country is $7.25. South Carolina doesn't have a state minimum wage, so we default back to the federal minimum wage. We have to guarantee wages of $14.62 an hour. We have to guarantee 3/4 of the work contract, which means we got 52 hours in our work contract, so you're going to get paid at least 40 hours a week. If you live outside of a 60-mile radius from us, we have to provide you free housing and free transportation. So all of our workers that come from Mexico, we provide them housing, we provide them transportation, yet we still can't get domestic workers to come. Now, let's understand, my town of Ridge Spring that I live in is population 600. So during the summer, I'm a bigger zip code than my town is because I actually, more people live on my farm than live in my town.
Wow.
That just goes to talk about the rural nature of it. I mean, Augusta's 45 minutes, Columbia's 45 minutes. My first stoplight is probably 10 miles away.
Wow.
So it's a very rural area.
Yeah. And obviously it's going to be hard to get Americans to come there and do that kind of work, especially seasonally. Now, here's where I think I have the biggest issue as what I describe myself as a rabid capitalist. You have jobs that are available. You have people who don't want to do those jobs here. You have people who are desperate to do those jobs in other places. And these are not even people who are trying to come here full time. They're not trying to be citizens. They're not trying to vote. They're not trying to get on welfare. They literally just want to come here and work. And you have the government then getting in the way and saying, one, you're restricted on who you can hire from that population, how you can hire them. And then two, it sounds like on what you have to pay them, what kind of supplies you have to give them. It seems like they're, even in this process, really driving maybe those costs farther above what they would naturally be.
They really are. So I can break down a lot of conversation in what you just asked, but let's break it down to cost to begin with. So in Mexico, you can go look and Google it right now. They've doubled their minimum wage in the last 5 years. Well, guess what their minimum wage? $1.20 an hour. So they went from 60 cents an hour to $1.20 an hour. Yet I'm paying $14.62. So our government made mandated wages get published in November. I start my contract in January. In 2022, the government told me I was going to have a 14% increase. A 14% increase on a $15 million payroll. That just raised the cost of peaches by 5% just on that one move. When you ask the government, why did you raise my wage 14% when no other wage in the government system is going up 4%? Why did agriculture go up 14%? Well, we've got to protect the American worker because these might be hard. They might be willing to take these jobs. No, I'm sorry. American workers have proven they're not willing to do it. There are 360,000 visas applied for every year, which means 360,000 jobs open up in agriculture, and less than 0.5% of Americans apply for those jobs. So it's not just my farm. We're talking across the whole continental U.S. These jobs are posted in California, in Arizona, in Texas, in Florida, which Florida is the #1 H-2A state, and nobody is taking these jobs.
Wow.
So please, if your audience can understand one thing, no, they are not taking American jobs. We're not trying to have cheap labor. But what we also want to do is not raise your food prices. Consumers' food prices are going up simply because of a mandated program that was created in 1987 and has not been touched again since then. The current administration is using policies and procedures to absolutely make it where farmers will not use this and to let unions into this program. And if you want to see your food prices go up, let this continue another 4 years and we're going to be in a very tough position.
I love that you bring this up because I think this is one of the most commonly misunderstood factors when we talk about immigration, particularly when it comes to laws around immigrants being able to come here and work, is that you do ultimately pick up that price. It does get pushed on to you as the consumer. And then another factor that I really had not thought about that deeply that you brought up when we were in Texas is not only does it drive up your prices of food, but ultimately that could drive your food production out of the country. And that could be a major security crisis for us, not having our own food produced here. Perhaps you get into a trade war with another country or they're mad at you for something. They withhold certain food. They drive the prices up. Can you touch on some of that a little bit? I know you said that this is already starting to occur where we're seeing a lot of farms being pushed outside of our borders.
Oh, you can see it every day. I mean, if you look at our leafy green industry, your salad mixes, There's a U.S. company that just built a whole processing plant in Mexico. You look at strawberries, more than 50% of the strawberries that come into this country now are produced in Mexico. Blueberries. Everybody used to understand bananas aren't grown in the U.S. Pineapples are only grown in Hawaii. So yes, you were going to import those. But now you're importing blueberries, you're importing lettuce, you're importing strawberries, bell pepper, cucumber. The import of tomatoes ever since NAFTA really started in 1990, and then the recent remodification of that, we have done nothing to protect our border to the south. We have a complete and open border with no tariffs, no trading, yet they don't abide by the same labor laws and everything else we do. So the production and the business environment climate is better in Mexico, and much more labor and much cheaper labor. So just like when our automobile industry transferred down there 20 years ago and Trump fought very hard to bring it back, that is what's happening to American agriculture. They're going down there. They got a subsidized industry where the Mexican government is actually investing millions and millions of dollars to build greenhouses, shade houses, so production can occur in areas where normally that production wouldn't be there. But by being in protected glass or protected cover, they now can control windows they couldn't compete in. When I say windows, production windows. And so their government has made it easy for them to do that. They've got the labor. And yes, American companies are going down. My company has looked at it. So we've had to, like I said, you're either going to get bigger or you're going to get out. It's one or the other.
It's interesting if you look back over the past couple of decades of American policy. Obviously, we've seen a lot of companies leave the country. Many factories have left. And you often hear people blame the company owners for that instead of the public policies that are driving those kinds of decisions, particularly making uncompetitive working environments when it comes to labor. We simply cannot continue to compete with other countries and make things here. So not only do you lose jobs and pushing things overseas, but you lose the economic boom that you're getting from having those things made here in America, sold in America, and then exported overseas. So I think that that's, long term, it's a disastrous combination. You see our neighbors and our competitors, they're making smart decisions to bolster their economy and to ensure that they have production occurring there. And we're doing the opposite. You talked a lot about the past couple of decades of public policy around immigration and particularly migrant labor here. And I thought it was really interesting. Basically, you said that, they didn't touch any of this for about 20 something years, 20 plus years. And then in the past, it seems 10 to 15 years, it's been a mega boom of various policies that they are consistently changing, rigging the game, moving things around. It seems very hard to keep up with. Can you talk kind of what that environment's been like for you?
What it's been like for me is absolutely tough. From the standpoint of, I've been engaged in immigration reform for over 20 years, and I would actually fire myself for my lack of productivity. I mean, I've worked on this as hard as I can. I was in the 13 bill in the negotiations when the Senate bill would actually pass with 68 votes, but then went to the House and, died immediately. The problem is simply this. We've got two factions going on with immigration reform. Those that want to legalize everybody that's here, whether you call it amnesty or some type of adjustment of status, they want to legalize that. That is definitely an agenda. Then you got those of us that want to do it the legal way, which is change our immigration policies to whatever people want to, but then create guest worker programs that allow us to go get workers when workers aren't available. Right now, I said our program is seasonal and temporary. There is so much of agriculture that's year round. So if you think about dairy farmers or mushroom farmers, anybody that farms year round or a diversified farm like my farm could be, but I had to stop because I can't fill in 2 more months of production because I can only have work here for 10 months. We're limiting production. So think about our dairy industry that has had no access to any legal labor at all. Now, milking cows is 365, 3 shifts a day. No U.S. worker wants to work at midnight on Christmas milking a cow. I'm sorry. But yet we can't come to some realization in this country that we need to create a program that will let foreign workers in here who we know who they are, we know where they're at, we have an entry and exit system so we can track them, and they want to come over here. Part of these guest worker programs, just so your audience knows, is they have to prove that they're going to stay in Mexico. Their families don't come with them. They have to have a residence in Mexico to even participate in the program. So there can be no willing intent to migrate to the U.S. Now, after 10, 15 years of doing this, they may want to. But initially, these workers want to come here because of the economic opportunity is better for their families if they come here and work. So I have men that have worked for me for 25 years who have left their families for 9 months of the year, come here and work, but have yet made such a better life for their families back home. The sacrifice is worth it. Well, that's what our grandparents did for us. Everybody went and worked hard to provide a better life for them. Now we have jobs that people aren't willing to do, and we've got to recognize that. So in an immigration, we need to make sure that guest worker reform is at the forefront of the debate and not the last part of the debate. Secure our borders first, figure out what we want to do on our overall policy, but in the meantime, let's create guest worker programs that will allow Americans in this country to feed ourselves, produce food and production for everybody else, and if we have enough left, hopefully be competitive enough to export outside of our country to help others.
I love your approach to this because it's so pragmatic. I often think
It's too pragmatic.
and it's crazy because it's so simple, right? When you really think about it, I've said this for some time. I'm a very pro-immigrant person. I do understand concerns people have, but so many of the questions we're debating around immigration could be put on a shelf over here, right?
Yep.
How do you get citizenship? How long does it take to get citizenship? That's fine to debate about. I'm not as upset about that. What grinds my gears is I think two things are really important here. One, I think free movement is a fundamental human right. You have a right to flee starvation, to flee war, to protect your body and your personhood and your family, and to seek places that are safe to live and exist. I think that that is something that needs to be protected to the best of our abilities for the vast majority of people. Secondarily, I think as a capitalist that you cannot have free markets without free movement. You have to have labor that's able to come and meet demand. Otherwise, you're going to continue to see prices go up. These are 1 and 1 equals 2 equations for me. It's very frustrating that we get so caught up in the weeds outside of this, where really I think we should be focusing on how do we ensure that people who need refuge can come here and legally work, and how do we ensure people who just want to work can come here and do it above book, and that it's easy for their employers to do it. Because I imagine not only are you having to pay additional costs to hire people into this program, but you're also probably having to spend a lot of your time not farming, a lot of your time on red tape and bureaucracy and just kind of figuring out what the system even entails year in, year out.
It's unbelievable. There are 4 government agencies that we have to go through just to get a worker here. Not one, 4 different agencies touch this program. So part of our immigration reform is why don't we put this in USDA, who is there to service American farmers? The USDA agency is there. That's what they're designed for. But yet we have to go through USCIS, which is a part of the State Department. We have to go to Department of Homeland Security. We have to go through the Department of Labor, and we have to go through our state workforce agency just to get one worker over here. The application time frame, the cost, and everything is just unbelievable. Remember, I've been doing this for 25 years. I have a 96% return rate in my workers, but every year I have to go back and do the same thing over and over again. Why can't we just say, yes, came here legally last year, went home legally last year? They should be able to come right back in. How hard would this be? Okay, if there's a new worker, if there's somebody, fine, go to the interview at the consulate, interview them. Give them same thing, let them come. But oh no, we got to go through 4 agencies, and you got to struggle right now within the agencies. You got Department of Homeland Security wanting enforcement power, which by definition of the legislation was only given to the Department of Labor. But now you got the Department of Homeland Security wants to get in enforcement. It's just, why? We just don't want bigger government. We all know that. Let's make an efficient government. But at the border, let's stop the porous border. Let's understand who's coming here, recognize that, but then create a system. Because right now, all these ones that come across, used to be agriculture was the gateway for illegal immigration. They would come across there, they would start in agriculture. We did an amnesty in 1986 when this program was founded. 5 years later, those workers were no longer in agriculture, yet we failed to fix this temporary program for agriculture. So since then, we're talking early 90s, we've all been facing it. All these ones crossing the border right now, you can ask agriculture across one spectrum of this country that they're not showing up on the farms anymore. I don't know where these people are going, but again, give me a program that I can do it legally, and I wouldn't want to hire anybody. And that's what we dug our line in the sand in 1999, and we said we were going to do this the legal way, and that's what we've done. Would my company have been better off? I probably could have been a lot more money in my pocket doing it the other way, but this was the right way to do it.
And you've been fighting alongside a pretty large coalition of farmers for some of these reforms for quite some time. I'm curious because there's often this perception and rhetoric to match it, I guess, of Republicans being anti-immigration, Democrats being pro. But as somebody who works in public policy, I haven't actually seen very many pro-immigrant policies from Obama or Biden. What's your experience working kind of in the political apparatus between the partisanship? Is my perception correct that both are pretty bad and making it worse, or what
they're both pretty bad, but farmers have to take some of the blame ourselves. There's a difference in the feelings across the country. If you're, like I said, if you're in the dairy or mushroom industry, you're really not interested in my concerns about temporary labor reform because you're really wanting year-round workers, and you can't see the forest for the trees saying, why don't you work with me on making my program year-round, when you're more concerned about legalizing the current workforce you might be working that's undocumented. So when there's a lot larger percentage of undocumented workers in the West, California being the #1 ag state in the country, and by true definition, probably 50 to 75% of its workforce is undocumented, they're more interested in getting that workforce documented than they are creating a guest worker program, because quite frankly, they don't have the experience in it like we have over in the East. The further the way you've been for the border, meaning further states you're farther away from the border, you've adopted the H-2A program to have reliability of labor. So we've been divided amongst ourselves. I mean, yes, there is a coalition, the Ag Workforce Coalition, but there are times where we can't all get together. So that's a problem in itself. And you want to give a congressman or a senator excuse when you've got one agricultural industry coming in and saying one thing and another one coming in the next minute saying something different. My own Senator Graham has told me several times, till you all get on the same page, don't expect us to do anything. So we've given them a way out. The debate really comes down to, what are you going to do with the current workforce? And then what is a guest worker program? The Democrat believe in they should have representation, unions should be involved. Of course, we don't believe that at all. We do a great job of taking care of our workers with our return rate. It pretty much says that. And plus, I've got every government eye looking at me anyway. So, but the workers' testimony, that your workers come back, is your best testimony that you're doing a good job and you're taking care of them. Simplest part is if we could get some rational thinking at this. President Bush, first time I got to go to the White House in 2006, he made the best and truest statement ever. He said, the extremes on both sides of this will yell so loud that it will outvoice the middle where the common sense is. And it's not changed since then.
I want to circle back to what you said about unions. Full disclosure, I hate unions. I'm kind of a union monster. I think they're terrible. I think they've done terrible things to the American economy and workforce over the decades across every sector they've touched. What's your experience more specifically been with unions, and how much are they driving some of these, I would say, I guess, protectionist type policies, particularly in some of the mandates that you face for how you have to pay workers and how you have to house them? And how much is this, them trying to do what they typically do and shield their own people from competition?
Well, it's interesting when you say shield their own people, because the biggest union is the United Farm Workers Association, UFW. And I don't know their exact membership, but I hear it's somewhere less than 7,000 members, that they're trying to represent 2 million agricultural workers. But in 2013, it was the UFW on one side of Senator Feinstein's table, and it was the agriculture industry on the other side of the table. The unions are always at the table when it comes to agriculture and immigration policy. And that is a shame, because they have sometimes stopped policy. Right now, we've had this administration issue 6 different rules. So they're not using legislature, they're using rulemaking through the Department of Labor and Department of Homeland Security. The last rulemaking that just came out, the closed comment period about a month ago, you might as well just call it the unionization bill. It's called the Worker Protection Bill. Well, you might as well call it the unionization bill. And I'm sorry, that's exactly what it is. When the unions have the right now to come onto my property anytime they want to, that I have to give them the name, address, and phone number and email addresses, if I have them, of my workers and anybody that works at my farm. And that's what this rule does. But they also were the ones that just implemented, the unions were behind the new wage increases, where we now had to pay multiple wages into this program instead of the $14.67. If my job was determined that truck driving was one of my jobs, I have to pay the U.S. standard truck driving wage, which is like $28 an hour. But I don't have to pay that just to one guy doing the truck driver. If it's in my job, I have to pay it to all 800 of them, even if they don't drive a truck. Oh, yeah. Believe that. I mean, that's what this rule did.
Wow.
And I mean, and we saw this actually done in the legislature. 2 Democratic congressmen put this forward and tried to make it law. And I spend more time stopping bad legislation than I can work on good legislation going forward. And that's the truth.
I know that feeling very well. That is outrageous. And it really, it's something that I think about a lot when we talk about who's impacted most by this. It really is people who are living on the margins in this country, because ultimately that's who cannot afford their groceries. That's who can't afford fresh food. That then informs their diet. That then affects their healthcare costs. I mean, food is such a fundamental component of life. And we have American farmers who are working so hard. As you mentioned, this is not an easy job. This is a lot of work. It's a tough job. You are already, having to live with natural conditions that you face year in, year out. And then you have the government coming in and putting its thumb on the scale and just making it even harder. I'm curious if there's anything I haven't asked you about we should touch on that folks should know in my audience from your experience.
I think the biggest thing you folks should know is that farmers in this country, we love what we do. It's a passion. If somebody thinks we're doing this to get rich or anything else, I'm sorry, that there's way too many risks. Last year, I lost 70% of my crop. It was a $30 million night and one night to a freeze. I mean, I've got probably a $45 million peach crop setting on the trees right now, and I'm not out of the danger. So the risk that we take, I'm sorry, there'd be a whole lot of things I could do, but this is a passion of love, just like immigration reform is a passion of love. I want this country to still remain strong. If you remember, we lived by policy dealing with oil for 30, 40 years. Wait till we start making policy on food, because we're dependent on other countries to feed us. And this is what I'll remind everybody. A country that cannot feed itself cannot defend itself. It's that simple. And you go look through history, ask, why is China buying up land all across the continent, all across the world? It's so they could feed 3 billion people, okay? Because they don't want to have duress. Well, this country has never really seen food shortages. COVID, shelves were empty. I had somebody actually write me a letter. Please don't be greedy. Let those workers go home. Excuse me, where's your food going to come from if my workers go home? So we were essential workers and we worked right through it. Now, so the biggest thing to this is we want this country to remain strong. Farmers are the backbone of this country. We want to produce food here. We want to produce the safest food we possibly can, but we also want to be able to compete. And right now the deck is stacked against us. So I would just ask them to help us. If they don't understand it, take time to get into the debate and read about it. We're asking for a system that will allow people, if there's no U.S. workers wanting to do these jobs, let us bring workers in, let them go back home, let us, this will work. It has worked for years. And every developed country in the world has a guest worker program. Canada has one, and it's a whole lot better than ours. All of Europe has one. So let's just understand there are jobs that people aren't going to want to do, no matter what wages you pay them or anything else. But anything I pay them is going to raise the food cost. And that's what people need to. It will affect you, and it's affecting you right now. Food inflation is second to transportation inflation, and wages in agriculture are higher, 2 times higher increases than any other industry in the U.S. in the last 5 years.
Wow.
And it's all because of the government.
We are just shooting ourselves in the foot. Well, Mr. Carr, I really appreciate your advocacy. I appreciate your work. You're doing something that's so vital for our country and for humanity. And I just really was so pleased to get to encounter you at the border. I want to thank you for taking the time to come here and talk to my audience about your important work. Is there anywhere they can plug in with you or anything else they should check out if they want to take further action?
They can go to our usafarmers.com. They can go to the American Agricultural Workforce, should be .com. And then, of course, Titan Farms, they can reach out to me at Titan Farms, www.titanfarms.com. And sure, I'd be glad to help them whenever we can. Just eat more peaches.
Yeah.
Got to have a good summer of peaches, so we need everybody to eat peaches.
Yeah. Make sure you eat some Titans peaches this summer. I know I will be. Well, thank you again, Mr. Carr. It was really good speaking with you. I hope you found these two gentlemen as insightful as I did. I thank them both again so much for lending me their time and for their advocacy and for their ongoing work in this country. While I continue to hold very principled stances on immigration, which again, I encourage you to go actually watch my old video if you want to get the full lowdown on my views, because I did a ton of research on it. I think that it gets really into the weeds and I simply don't want to get distracted here today. Instead, I want to focus on policies that are actually going to work. I think too often when we talk about immigration, we have people who are all the way over here or all the way over here, and they will refuse to talk. They refuse to meet in the middle. And this is such a big issue. That's what it's going to require for anything to get better. And ultimately, that is something that we should be pragmatic about. One of the conversations at the border I was not able to bring back for you occurred when I went to visit a Catholic NGO where many people who have been processed are sent to stay while they await relatives or other sponsors to come and meet them. Via a translator, I was able to speak with one man at that facility who told me his horrifying story. He was trying to come here legally. He'd been given a court date. He and his son were trying to drive across the Mexican border in order to attend that court date. And in the process, they were kidnapped by the cartel, held as hostages. His wife, back in his home country, had to come up with thousands of dollars to ensure that they were not killed or maimed. And he is very lucky to be alive. The current system hurts people. It wastes our resources. It violates our core principles. It impedes our economy. And oftentimes, it gets people literally killed. What we're doing right now makes zero sense. So if we don't end up with an Ellis Island system tomorrow, I'm okay with that. But we need to be taking steps that would at least move in a direction where things make sense, where people are told what the playbook is, and when they try to do the right thing, it actually works out for them. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the 2 interviews I presented here today. Let me know if you learned something new, if this changed your mind about how you think through immigration issues. And if you still have questions about my stance or about the system at large, let me know. I'll try to answer them in future videos.